Hikers of Reddit, what has been the most screwed up thing you've seen? Story 1. A few years ago, a new hiking buddy climbed up a waterfall, slipped on some pine needles on the top, and fell 40 feet down onto rock. I was the first person there. Blood was pouring out of the head, broken spine, and the spine broke through the skin. He bit below his mouth and pretty much had a second mouth. It took an hour or two for medics to get to us and another 2 hours to use ropes to lift him out of the valley to a helicopter. Miraculously, he was out of the hospital after a few months and eventually regained full movement. All medical experts were shocked he made a full recovery. Most traumatic event of my life by far. Story 2. I was in the Frank Church Wilderness in Idaho doing some biological survey work. We were 30 miles from the nearest trailhead and got an early start to avoid the heat. About a mile into our hike, we hear the bushes stir near the trail. Up pops a man wearing nothing but a loincloth and Nikes, carrying a very small bag and a hunting rifle. He says, "Mornin'," and takes off sprinting down the trail. Never did see him again. So many questions. Story 3. I was on a long hike in the Oregon Cascades to a small lake. I came across an abandoned campfire that was spreading out from the rock ring. The area was about the size of a small car. I rushed to build a fire break and ran up and down the hill to the lake for water. Took me about a dozen trips with my sleeping bag sack to extinguish it. I was 100% sure a forest fire would have broken out. Story 4. Me and my friend had just set up camp and chilled for a little bit, but not far from a pretty overgrown trail that seemed almost abandoned and forgotten. We were spooked by a noise, and it was a mountain biker coming down that steep and bad trail rather recklessly. He then stopped. He hastily pulled down his shorts and squatted down to spray crap everywhere before he kept going. We were pretty much camouflaged, so he never even noticed us watching. Story 5. So, about 5 years ago, a friend and I were hiking in the Oregon Cascades in the mid-spring. We were about 6 miles in from the road, nowhere near a trail, on about 6 feet of snow. We were going out for 5 days to attempt to summit a few peaks, so we looked like grizzly mountain men. Around a tree comes 2 guys and a dog. Mid-50s, his son mid-20s, and Fifi. They are wearing trail running shorts, running shoes, and a running water backpack, aka nothing of real use. "PCT open?" they asked. Friend and I looked at each other, looked at them, tried not to laugh, and explained. We are 5 miles from the PCT and 2,000 feet lower in elevation. What are you trying to do? They planned on doing a 20-mile run along the PCT starting on the other side of the mountains but got sidetracked due to snow. Again, we explain that they are screwed. I tell them that there is a road with cell service 6 miles downhill along our tracks, and if need be, we can hike them out. They refused and asked if the PCT was open again. I flat out told them, "You are screwed. Let me hike you out." They were like, "Nah, we got this," and ran off in the wrong direction. We camped there for the night and followed their tracks for a half mile the next morning. They disappeared. No signs of them. After a few stormy days and failed summit attempts, we hiked out. I drove around to the parking area they mentioned and looked through the wilderness permit tags to try and find a name. Nothing. It gets weird though. A few years later, my parents ran into the same nondescript people in the same area again asking about a trail loop. Same conditions. Late winter, snowshoeing far from a road, and they were lost. My dad also tried to hike them out, and they declined and took off in the wrong direction. He followed their tracks for about half a mile before he lost them. So if anyone sees the ghosts of the Oregon Cascades, let me know. Story 6. I had hiked in 15 miles to an alpine wilderness and laid down for the night when a young-ish guy in shorts and no bag pops out and asks me if I have water. I, of course, shared my water. He immediately said he had been hiking since yesterday. Apparently him and his friend went way back and off trail, skirting some cliffs along the way. Then he says, just half-jokingly, yeah, his brains are everywhere. I laughed half-acidly, but he was sending off a really deadly vibe. Not dangerous, just stone-cold shock. I asked him to clarify that last part and offered him food and a cigarette. I also ordered him to sit down. He didn't want to because he would lose his legs if he sat now, but I explained he needed to sit for a while. Long story short, his friend slipped and fell, and when he hit, his head popped and then his body got wedged in a crevice. The guy I was talking to had spent all the previous day hiking around the cliff to find his friend, then had to hike out of the valley up the ridge and down again, all on Talus Slope off trail. He was absolutely shredded, skinned, torn up. He was begging me to come with him and help him get his friend out of the hills. That's the part that really stuck with me. He got up and was about 3 feet into the bush when I grabbed him gently and said, "Hey, I got a phone, we'll see if emergency services works." Somehow it did, and I have zero idea how, technically or otherwise. We were standing in a glacial cratered alpine lake, 15 miles from the trailhead. I got rescue up there and man, I was super impressed with their response. Within a few hours, the first group of volunteers were passing my camp. These guys all looked like supermen, and they were. All night afterwards, a constant stream of rescue volunteers. I stayed camp and made a comfy spot for them to rest on the way down. They had to wait up there in whiteout conditions for 6 nights, but rather than leave, they kept a constant vigil over the hiker's dead body. When the weather broke, a chopper flew in and took them all out. I've never been so deeply moved and impressed with that kind of selflessness in something we regard as a hobby, a sport. Words that take away the very dangerous nature of it. Read all these stories and it seems like most are deaths by slip and fall. Happens too easy. Don't take the chance with your life. Story 7. I did a wilderness survival course when I was a teen, so I have a few of these. I've told the forest fire story a million times in similar threads. Probably next best one would be Giardia in a situation where we couldn't get medevac out there for quite some time. Giardia is already an awful thing to contract when you have quick access to any semblance of privacy and comfort. But it's a camper's disease, so that's usually not the case, and it wasn't here either. One of the girls got it, and by the time they called for med-evac, she had been mildly symptomatic for a few days. And because of the weather condition, they had to send a truck, and it took quite some time. So she was in the thick of it for a couple days in the camp. We dug a separate hole for her to crap in. We all had to assist with her care, but also kept away because of how crazy contagious it is. Edit, crazy contagious if you can't stay clear of other people's crap, which we really couldn't. But because this was a treatment establishment, she couldn't be out of line of sight of staff for very long, so she basically just lived next to her crap trough. I think the scariest part for me was, initially, she was embarrassed. What teen girl, or anyone TBH, wouldn't be, if their peers had to hear and see them having explosive diarrhea into a hole? I heard her cry to staff about it, beg for privacy, etc. But the scary part was that by day 2, so much energy and life had faded out of her, and she was so bad off that all semblance of embarrassment, shyness, etc. had completely left her. She just sort of laid down next to the trough and kept her pants down and scooted backwards towards it when she needed to go. When she wasn't crapping, she was in a lot of pain, so she'd just sort of lie there and moan. I genuinely thought she was going to die. Giardia isn't a death sentence at all, very survivable, but 15-year-old me didn't know that, and watching it happen was one of the scariest things I've ever seen. Story 8. I walked past a campsite with a ton of smashed alcohol bottles and trash. Started feeling uncomfortable and walked faster to where the trail looked over a canyon. Smelled something bad and looked down to see, like 3 feet from me, 2 bloated dead dog heads sticking out from a rolled up tarp. Immediately turned around and booked it to my car. I called the Forest Service to report it. I think some people got drunk and killed the dogs, or maybe it was a dog fighting thing. There may have been more under that tarp, but I was freaked out. I think if it was someone's pets, they would have tried to bury them. Story 9. My ex and I went for a little evening hike on the trails by our campground, and it felt eerie, and we kept turning around because we felt like we were being followed, but we never saw anything. When we got back to the trailhead, we got chewed out by the park ranger, because they had a lot of mountain lion activity, and we weren't supposed to be out at dusk. That feeling I hope I never feel again. Story 10. I was on the Matanuska Glacier ice climbing, and before we started scaling the wall, a tour guide walked up with a group he was showing around. There was a small waterfall, and he filled up his water bottle, explaining how this is the best water in the world, the most pure, and blah blah blah. Anyway, we climb up like 20 feet, and there in the stream, just above the waterfall, is the dead and rotting carcass of some kind of bird or mammal. Completely gray and directly feeding the waterfall he just filled up his bottle with. Story 11. This is more camping after a day of hiking, but my husband and I decided to set up in a campground where no one else was. The gate to the area was open but weirdly deserted. We may have been too early into the season, March, and we guessed the gate was accidentally left open but decided, why not? We'll enjoy some peace and quiet in a usually full campground. During the night, we were woken up by noises and saw 2 trucks with their headlights on pulling into the camp and people jumping out of the beds with flashlights. We were so scared these people were going to find and hurt us. Probably sounds silly, but we weren't sure what these people's intentions were. Sometimes humans are scarier than nature. After they looked around for a bit, they got back in the trucks and left. They didn't spot our tent in the trees towards the back of the camp, but holy, we were ready to go after that. They could have just been checking out the campground if they wanted to stay there, but the vibe just felt really creepy, like they were looking for something. Story 12. When I was a teenager, we went away for a week of camping at the Scout Reserve. My dad was our scoutmaster, and we were mostly all friends from growing up. There was this one kid, Andre, the youngest, that we didn't really know that well and was definitely kinda weird. Withdrawn and awkward, just kinda different, but still a sweet guy that everyone liked. Toward the end of the week, we went out on an overnight, just the scouts without my dad or his buddy, who was the other scouter. We took a boat across the lake and then hiked for hours into the bush. It was a really hot day and my older brother was leading us but not drinking any water and wearing a light jacket which made him extra hot. Eventually, we found a sweet spot next to a huge cliff which we jumped off into the lake below for hours until we made a fire and cooked dinner. Eventually, we all fell asleep under the stars. Around 4:30 a.m., just before sunrise, my friend Sean woke me up and asked if I knew where Andre was. I said no, but that maybe he went to pee. But after 5 minutes, he wasn't back. So we got up and started looking around and calling his name. Nothing. So we ranged a little further, and then I saw his sleeping bag at the edge of the cliff. I freaked out and ran over to see if I could see anything at the bottom, but I didn't. We tried to get my brother up, but he was pretty sick from heat stroke, so I took charge of the situation. We started ranging out into the woods and calling his name. One of the guys started doing the emergency whistle call, 3 short whistles, but we were really deep in the middle of nowhere. I started going deeper into the woods, calling his name. Then I thought I heard something. I stopped and listened and heard a faint cry deep in the woods. So I started running, crashing through thick undergrowth, getting lashed in the face with branches and stumbling across fallen logs. His cries got louder, and eventually I found him in this huge clearing in the woods to find him sitting there on a fallen tree in his underwear and a t-shirt. He said he'd been there for hours, having woken up on the ground in the dark and having no idea where he was, so sat it out, waiting for dawn. It was really spooky. The craziest thing was that his watch had been reset, so he didn't know what time it actually was. We all accepted that it was probably just sleepwalking, but he was so far in the woods and didn't have a scratch on him. And this clearing was so bizarre because it was big and round in the middle of these really dense woods. To this day, I wonder what really happened. Story 13. Not really screwed up, but it scared the crap out of me. One time, a buddy and I were camping around Diamond Lake in Oregon. I can't remember the exact name of the site, but it was around that area. This was the off-season, and we were the only ones camping around this lake. It was pitch black out, with the exception of our campfire. So around 1 in the morning, we were just chillin', smoking a bowl, and, talking. The area we were at had a hill just above us with a lot of trees and bushes on it. We're sitting there and we start hearing a cracking sound and then a huge crash and something sounding like it's rolling and then another huge smash. We get the flashlight on looking up the hill and all we see is dust and debris falling down. We totally freaked out. We didn't know what happened, but we decided to go to bed. Well, the next morning when we woke up, we started to notice a gigantic, dead old tree that had fallen and started rolling down the hill. You could see where it broke off up the hill and rolled all the way down, breaking smaller trees along the way. It was probably 30 feet tall and was big and chonky. It was completely sideways and was only stopped by 3 other trees that held it back up the hill. It would have rolled right through our campsite if the other trees hadn't stopped it. I was freaked out the night before, but seeing it in the light of day, knowing how close we came to dying, was way more terrifying. Story 14. A few years ago, my wife and I were on vacation. We were hiking up a popular mountain, maybe 1 hour for 1,000 feet of elevation gain. When we got to the top, there were several people at the summit hanging out. One girl was sitting by herself close to the edge. The summit cliff is a sheer 1,000-foot drop all the way down, so it's pretty exposed. I didn't think much of it, though. The summit area is pretty large, so there were groups of people spread out in different places. My wife and I were a little ways away from her when all of a sudden, boom! I hear a loud thud and a cloud of dust fly up off the side of the cliff. I stood there in shock for a few seconds. I didn't want to look over where the girl was sitting and see that she wasn't there anymore. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. There's no way that actually happened though, right? She must have got up and left. I asked my wife if she heard or saw anything, and she said no. I asked the people near us. They say no. I said, okay, it was just a rock or something. Then, I saw her backpack still sitting there, exactly where she was sitting. I'm trying to convince myself that I didn't just witness someone commit suicide, but every excuse I tell myself just doesn't add up. I didn't see her get up and leave. Her backpack is still there. The distinct thud sound that I heard could have only been made by something the size and thickness of a human, and there was no yelling, screaming, or crying for help. Nothing. I was slowly coming to grips with the fact that I had just witnessed a suicide. We called 911, told them what I saw, and they said they'd send search and rescue to the mountain to try and recover the body. I picked up her backpack and we started down the trail. When we got to the bottom, the police were there. They asked me a bunch of questions and I gave them the backpack. As I finished up with the officer, I got really emotional. What if that girl were my friend or family member? I'd want to know about what happened. I decided to give my phone number to the cop. I said if the family wants to talk to me, if they want closure on things, etc., they can feel free to contact me. That's what I would want, and I think it's the least I could do for them if they so choose. 2 hours later, my wife and I are at dinner. I get a call. It's an officer from the search and rescue team. Hello, we just wanted to let you know that we recovered the body. The girl's ID in the backpack you gave us did indeed fall from the cliff. Damn. Dinner was really solemn that night. 1 week later, my wife and I are back home from vacation and I get a call. It's a family member of the girl. They just asked some basic questions and I tell them the story. At no point, however, did I mention suicide. It was clear that when they started talking on the phone with me that they thought it was an accident. As soon as I picked up on that during the conversation, I coached myself. Do not mention suicide unless they ask for my opinion. They never asked. I thought that would be the conclusion. A couple years later, I get a Facebook message from a person who I don't know. It said they were friends with the girl who died on the mountain, and they have some questions about it. Again, feeling the same sense of compassion, I gave them my phone number. It turns out the person who messaged me was the girlfriend of the girl who died. Since she/her pronouns are going to get confusing at this point, I'll just give them fake names. Let's call the girl who died Amanda and her girlfriend that messaged me Michelle. Michelle asked about that day, what I saw, and I gave her as much detail as I could. When I finished describing everything, she started talking about their relationship. Amanda and Michelle were from different parts of the country. She told me that they were going through a rough patch at the time, partly due to the fact that Amanda's family wouldn't accept them being in a lesbian relationship. Amanda got so upset that she left, drove back home across the country, and didn't return any of Michelle's calls. Because of the lack of communication, Michelle thought that Amanda was just too upset to talk about what was bothering her. For some time, Michelle was going through a lot of hurt not having any communication from Amanda. It turns out, no one from Amanda's family had told her what happened. They had disapproved of their relationship so strongly that they didn't even tell her that she died. They didn't tell her about her funeral, didn't try to communicate with her whatsoever. It was months before Michelle finally found out. She was completely devastated that this whole time she was thinking that Amanda wasn't calling her back when she was actually dead. Worse yet, the disrespect from Amanda's family was crushing her. Michelle was only able to get a hold of one of Amanda's family long enough for them to tell her that it was an accident. No further details, no further communication. This didn't sit well with her, so she began to investigate. After months of searching, she was finally able to get a hold of the search and rescue team that was there on the day of Amanda's death. She was able to submit a request for the police report and waited anxiously to get a copy. When she got the copy of the police report, she was confused because it didn't match what the family member told her. She saw my name as a witness, but apparently my phone number had gotten crossed out, so that's why she had to find me on Facebook. 2 years of pain, hurt, disrespect, struggle, searching, calling sheriff's departments and database requests, and she finally got a hold of me. When I got on the phone with her, I coached myself again, do not mention suicide unless she asks for my opinion. This time, the person on the other end of the phone did ask. It may have been the sole reason she searched so long to contact me. I obliged, softly and empathetically. Michelle, I can't tell you with 100% certainty, but if you want my honest opinion, I would have to say that, yes, it was suicide. I cried as I said it, and she cried as she listened. She said it was really good to at least have closure. She said she knew deep down before she even talked to anyone that that was probably the case. It was going to eat at her until she found out. Here's the worst part. Michelle also said that the family is adamant about the fact that Amanda's death was an accident. If they admitted to it being a suicide, then they'd have to conclude that she was depressed. When they would have asked why she was depressed, they'd have to conclude that the source of her depression was the fact that she was a lesbian but her own family wouldn't accept her. Thus, they'd have to admit that they were partly responsible for what happened, but they would never, in a million years, own up to the fact that their tough love of disapproving a lesbian relationship actually drove her to taking her life. And that was the most messed up thing that ever happened to me while I was hiking. Story 15. I don't know if this counts as hiking, but we were driving to a national park to go hiking when we stopped because the driver, my buddy's dad, had to pee. We decided it was a good time to stretch our legs, so we started walking down the highway. I noticed something on the ditch next to the road. I went over and saw what looked like the body of a giant deer. Its neck was torn open and there was no head in sight. My buddy informed me that it was actually a moose. Now, I'd never seen a moose in the flesh before, so I was looking at it out of curiosity when I heard my buddy's dad call out, "Guys, I found it." I walk over to see what he was talking about, and there was the head of the moose a couple 100 meters away, antlers all smashed. It was pretty grisly. We were confused as to what happened to him. We think maybe a truck hit him so hard it decapitated him, and the driver just pushed the body into the ditch and decided to nope out of there. My buddy's dad thought that seemed unlikely, especially since there wasn't any blood on the road and no sign of an accident. We decided to just get back in the car and continue on our way.